just love talking about worms. This is one of our funnest sections to me. Worms are the ultimate composter. They are really good at breaking down organic matter. If they're outside, they're breaking down leaves. They're breaking down little dead little microfauna and microflora in your soil, things like that. If you have a vermiculture kit, not viticulture, y'all know viticulture is something totally different. That has to do with grapes and wine. Vermiculture kit, that is using worms to compost. And if you have your own vermiculture kit, then you can feed your worms all kinds of scraps from your kitchen, pieces of squash, pieces of spinach, pieces of cucumber, cherries, apples, whatever you have, whatever scraps, just throw them in there and they will actually break it down and poop out some black gold. So remember when we talked about soil amendments, we talked about worm castings. Worm castings is actually worm poop, where they just eat, and they poop out a very rich soil. Very high in nutrients. Do you remember our top 3 macronutrients? NPK. So they, the black gold, the worm poop, the worm castings, very high in NPK, also high in our other macronutrients and our micronutrients in a very easy way for the plant to take up. Remember, this is a really easy way. This isn't feeding the plant a cow. It's feeding the plant some hamburger. So some hamburger gravy, something really easy for them to eat. So it is easy for them to take up, and it also improves soil texture, which, remember, soil texture is the soil's ability to hold water so that your soil doesn't just go dry, wet, that it has moisture in it for the roots to take up a little at a time. So worms are super, super helpful. If you want your own vermiculture kit, just because we can't do it as a class this quarter doesn't mean you can't do it on your own. I'm going to put a link on Moodle so you can go visit Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, and that's my favorite. They're kind of far away, but even more than some of the local sources that I found, that's my favorite source of worms. So you can put your worms in a Tupperware, big Tupperware. You can put your worms in a bucket. You can put them in an old bathtub outside. And for me, if I get tired of taking care of my worms for a while, I just turn them loose in the garden. I just bury a little hole or dig a little hole, put the worms in there, cover them up, and then I've got them. They're still working for me. So let's talk a little bit about the worms themselves so you have some idea about these critters. So first of all, worms are in the phylum, or kingdom Animalia, phylum Annelid. Okay, so when we talk about other worms, for example, if we're talking about say a nematode and we call it a worm, it's not really related to like a earthworm or a red wiggler. Red wigglers being your best composters. Or night crawler. It's not really related. How you know it's related is if it's an annelid. An annelid is going to be your red wigglers, your earthworms, your composters that work for you. So they're in the phylum Annelid, and you see why it's important to know the phylum, so you know if one worm is actually really related, if it's the same type of thing as another worm, because worm is just a morphological term, right? All right, but I'm going to use it. I'm going to say worm, but we're talking about annelids. So annelids, the term annelids literally means little rings, little rings. That's because our earthworms are actually segmented. You may not realize it, but they are. And you may have heard the old wives' tale that if you cut a worm in half, you can grow 2 new worms. That's not really true. There's a certain number of segments where you can cut the worm and the worm will heal and live. But if you go past that number of segments, it's just going to die. So please don't try that. It's just, there's just no reason to. It's cruel. So don't go cut up a worm. But anyway, our worms are made of little segments. Let's talk about the digestive system of a worm. So a worm has something, believe it or not, in common with some birds. A worm has a gizzard. All right. That's just going to be my representation of a gizzard. Let me give him a mouth. All right, there we go. And you know, at the end out poops the black gold. All right. So what is a gizzard? So a gizzard is like a grinder. So what happens is the worm, he eats some little tiny microscopic, you know, mineral components of the soil, little tiny microscopic rocks. And also his own body is going to put some enzymes in there. So you've got some rocks as your tumblers. You got some enzymes in there. And what happens is everything that he eats goes into the gizzard and just gets ground up, finer, and mixed with these enzymes. So what's your worm going to eat? Basically, almost anything that's in front of him. So somehow worms are really good about leaving good, healthy roots alone. So they're not going to hurt your plants, but pretty much anything like a dead leaf, a dead bug, anything that he can fit in his little tiny microscopic mouth, chomp, 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 he's going to eat, including mineral components of the soil. So everything that he eats is going to be mixed in with soil. So one thing that these enzymes do is it changes the pH of everything he eats and makes it a perfect pH for plants. So remember that was about 6.4 to 6.8. It also, these enzymes also kill a lot of harmful bacteria and, you know, just somehow it just knows what to kill. So anyway, it's really, really good. So he's going to eat almost anything he comes in contact with. It's going to go through the gizzard, get ground up, get to be a good pH, and get pooped back out again. So, what do I want us to tell you here? Yeah, we talked about what it's called, worm castings. All right, so let's talk about how worms move, because this is really cool. If you've ever held a worm in your hand, I think this is probably going to surprise you. Worms, believe it or not, have little bristles. On each segment, they have 2 little bristles. That is something you would just never expect. So they don't really move like a snake does. They have these little tiny bristles, which are kind of like their legs. They're little hairs, but they act as their legs and help them to move. So those little bristles are called setae. Setae. So each segment has a set of setae on it, and that's how they move. Their circulatory system is closed, so that means that they actually do have like veins and arteries. They're not just a sack of blood. They have a closed circulatory system. And they have, instead of 1 heart, they have 5 hearts. All right, but they don't, are they true hearts? Well, they don't really run the length of the whole worm, but my worm wasn't long enough. Should have drawn smaller hearts. So, they're not really true hearts like ours, okay? What they are called is aortic arches. So a worm has 5 aortic arches. 5 aortic arches and a closed circulatory system, okay? So that's how they pump their blood. So you can still think of those as their hearts. Respiration. Do worms have lungs? No, they don't. So, and in fact, I'm going to get a new worm going. There we go. All right. So worms do not have lungs, but they still have to exchange gases. They still have to do respiration, just like we do. So how does a worm breathe if it doesn't have lungs? So a worm actually breathes through its skin. If you let a worm dry out and his skin dries up, he's not going to be able to breathe. He'll actually suffocate. So you don't want to let him get dry. But if you put a worm in water, now they can live for a little while in water. But basically, again, they will eventually die because they're not able to do respiration properly. So they need to be damp. If you get some worms and you want to take care of them, how damp does the soil need to be? About like a wrung out sponge. So you want to be able to grab some soil and feel the dampness in it. But if you squeeze it, you don't want water to just drip through your fingers. So it's like a damp wrung out sponge. That's about how damp you want your worms to be, so that they can do respiration properly. Reproduction. So this is, I'm telling you, nature is so cool. So here's the interesting thing about worms. Worms, first of all, they need a mate, okay? So I'm going to draw 2 worms. Just to remind you, they need a mate to reproduce. They cannot reproduce on their own some critters out there can, not worms, but they are hermaphroditic. So hermaphroditic means they have both male and female gametes. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? So what happens is the worms just, they all get together in like a little bundle, like a little worm orgy. And as they're rolling around, they have one segment that's kind of enlarged. If you've ever held an earthworm, you've probably seen that. So that has the eggs and some goo under it. So what happens is they rub around on each other, the eggs and the goo get rubbed out from under this enlarged segment, and then the worms and the goo mix up with the sperm, and they create little cocoons, little tiny cocoons. Well, they're certainly tinier than that. Tiny little things. So one worm may have 8 cocoons, may have 16 cocoons. It depends on the species of the worm, really. But those cocoons, I want to say, don't quote me on this, but I want to say about 8 weeks that they will hatch, and you'll have some new little worms. So that's pretty cool that worms are hermaphroditic, but they do need a mate. They do need another worm. Senses. Worms do not have eyes, and they don't have a nose. So how do they know when they're getting near food? Things like that. So they can sense light. They can sense dark and light. So they don't like really to be in the light. They want to, their photoreceptors tell them to stay buried. So let's say that you want to collect that black gold, some of the black gold they make. If you'll put a light on one end of your vermicomposting kit, the worms will go away from the light because they don't want to be in the light. So they don't have eyes, but they can sense the light and dark. They also don't have a nose, but they have chemoreceptors, so they can actually have a sense of smell. It's not really the sense of smell we have, but if you put a piece of bread in your vermicomposting kit or a piece of something that they really like, and here's a funny thing, if you get a kit, the worms have really different tastes. Like some kits will just love bread, and that's all they want to eat is bread. And some of them will love peaches, and others won't touch them. So that's kind of an interesting thing when you get your own kit, is to figure out what your worms like. If you leave it in there long enough, they're going to eat it, but they definitely have different preferences. So anyway, if you put a piece of bread, they're going to have a chemoreceptor. They're going to sense that bread is there so that they can crawl to it. So they can smell, just not with a nose like we do. They also can sense vibrations. So they know if you pick that up, or if you move the soil around, or if you're walking near them, they can actually sense that. And that's how they can kind of get away from danger. If a bird's coming and a bird's pecking on the ground looking for a good worm, hopefully they can crawl away fast enough. So they get along really well even without eyes and a nose. All right. So that's a little bit about the worms themselves. I'm not really going to go through how to take care of them, even though I hope some of y'all will try the Vermiculture kit. It's really fun, and I'm going to show you my worms in just a moment. So have a great day. See you next time.